Good afternoon. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today I want to talk. My name is Sangyoung, and today I want to talk about the alliance between my country, South Korea, and the U.S. And I'll take a closer look into the military alliance, especially, and this close look may resonate with your country's cases because today the world is not very different from the Cold War era, I think, because it is either the U.S. in the U.S. camp or not, an ally to the U.S. or an enemy to the U.S. So this case study of the military alliance between South Korea and the U.S. may have some implications to look back up on your cases. And before we move on to the next slide, I want to talk about my point. And the point I want to make is identity does matter in terms of the strengthening the alliance between those two countries. But the fact is that identity usually slips the mind of decision makers. But if it is not addressed, it's gonna be a problem that prevents the alliance from strengthening further. Because nowadays South Korea is trying to assess the alliance in terms of their identity, whereas the U.S. is not always have seen the alliance in terms of policy issues, discrete policy issues, and this imbalance will be a problem in the future. So let's get into my presentation. So I want to briefly get you the to help you get you the quick idea of how my presentation will be like. So I want to give you some examples of identity invoking events, by which I mean these events resulted in anti-US protests in South Korea, and that tainted the image of the US forces in South Korea. And then I'll move on to the important part to compare the two perceptions of the same alliance, first from the Korean perspective and then the US perspective. And this is the part I'll kind of move back and forth because I made a last minute decision to help you understand better. So let's bear with me, and I'll weapon my speech with possible policy recommendation that US forces in Korea can think about. So these are some examples of what happened, especially after 2000s, and all of these events dealt a blow to the relationship between South Korea and the U.S. And I used 3 columns to describe those events: when it happened, and what happened, and what's the result of the events. And I put some only dashes when I think the result is not very definitive and not very well defined. So, but among these, I want to shed light on the first case, what happened in 2002, and it's an event that a U.S. tank ran over 2 female middle school girls in South Korea, and that caused a huge nationwide anti-U.S. protest, and that really tainted the image of the U.S. forces in Korea. But the follow-up measure was considered as inappropriate, and it even stoked the fury of South Korean citizens. And yeah, that's a really milestone among these events. So I made 3 keywords that I think best describes the characteristics of South Korean perspective towards the alliance, and all of these characteristics amount to the imbalance, especially from the Korean perspective. It's very identity oriented, and you'll see with me. So as opposed to the policy oriented view of the United States. So I'll move from now on back and forth between 2 slides, so let's bear with me. And the first characteristic, the keyword I want to emphasize, is the divided perception towards the alliance in South Korea. This is what happened, especially when progressive parties took the office in 1998. President Kim Dae-jung from Progressive Party took the office and took a quite different approach to North Korea, and that usually South Korea never thought about. and they kind of divided the national opinion. And so now there is a dividing line between conservative camp, progressive camp, not only to North Korea but also to the U.S. forces presence in South Korea. And this is contrast to the unified perception of the United States, which is blanket positivism, because they only think in terms of policy. So they think bad time, by which I mean when the Progress parties took the office, passed. So it's really okay now because current administration is considered conservative with President Park. But the matter of fact is that the division of the national opinion has been institutionalized since then, and it's not a fad to go away, but it's here to stay. And the U.S., if doesn't consider that identity division in South Korea, it's gonna be a problem. And let's move on back to the second keyword of the South Korean perception. They are very much interested in the alliance, and they are really keen on what's going on in the United States, and especially its implication for the alliance. So, to take an example of the recent presidential visit by President Park, all the media in South Korea were occupied by every detail of her trip and every detail itineraries of her presidential visit and what's happened, how well she was treated, so on and so forth. But when it comes to the U.S. media, they were not very much interested, and the general idea is that South Korea is just one among many allies. And a very good example is the joint press conference with President Park and President Obama last week. So there were a lot of questions poured from reporters, but those questions were only oriented towards Obama, and it was not even related to South Korea. For example, whether Joe Biden will run for the presidential campaign or not. It's kind of they were kind of ignoring the presence of President Park, and this well represent how they think South Korea is important ally or not. And move back to the last keyword of the Korean perception. They think, of course, this doesn't represent the consensual perception of the entire citizen in South Korea, but there is a certain amount of people who think that the relations is kind of imperialistic. And because South Korea went through democratization and globalization and has become one of wealthy countries in the world, and it is really a part of, playing its role in the world affairs. So it deserves some recognition of its enhanced status, but it doesn't so far receive as the proper treatment from the U.S. And they think it's still a client and patron relationship and stuck to the kind of relationship. But from the U.S. perspective, they are already making a huge sacrifice. This is what exactly in the same line of what U.S. The Republican hopeful Trump once said, how much money they pay for the alliance. And that's why I put Korea's piggybacking on the sucking up to the U.S. budget for its own security. And they kind of used the same rationale that was prevalent in the Cold War era. We are preventing your countries from the threat of the North Korea and communism. But the problem is that it's kind of outdated, and South Korea is now quite different from the end of the Korean War. I'll answer your question at the end of my presentation if you don't mind. So based on these differences, this imbalance will bulge if not addressed sooner or later in the foreseeable future. So getting back to the original question of how to strengthen the military alliance between those two countries, what U.S. forces in Korea, I'm kind of oriented to what U.S. forces in Korea can do or cannot. So please keep that in mind. So in the long run, they may develop broader rationale beyond the peninsula because, as I said, the general opinion towards North Korea even diverge in South Korea. So it's not a very good excuse for the U.S. presence in South Korea. So they may join now South Korea is now trying to develop a broader agenda of keeping the peace in Northeast Asia. So they may join this kind of rationale to justify their presence in South Korea. But in the short run, they may think about strengthening public diplomacy because perception and identity doesn't matter. But so far, they only focused on the talks between government to government level, or military to government, or military to military level. So it's very worthwhile to think about strengthening public diplomacy towards the civilians in South Korea. And for that end, the U.S. forces in Korea may think about operating open channel, engaging local media, writing some op-eds to specify, to labor on their purpose on doing some activities. And especially because I don't want that to happen, but as long as they stay in South Korea, there could be more identity invoking events, unfortunate events in the future. So, but on the flip side, this is a very rare chance that they can garner nationwide attention, that they can show their responsibility towards the alliance. So if they do and perform their unprecedented responsibility in the future, that might change the perception to a better position. So this brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you. And I'll question, please.
Well, at a certain point, you described the relationship of